today's video, we will study the events and people that led to the development of ideas in the theory of evolution. By the end of the lesson, you shall be able to attain the following learning targets. To guide you with the discussion, the topics are outlined as follows. First, we will tackle the old beliefs of the scientists before Charles Darwin in the history of evolutionary thought. Second, we will discuss in detail the voyage and observations of Darwin that led him to write on the origin of species. And third, you will be introduced to the concepts of modern synthesis as a unified theory of evolution. Let's begin with the first part. Although Charles Darwin typically receives credit for developing the theory of evolution, many scientists made significant contributions in understanding the diversity of life. In ancient Greece, Aristotle recognized that organisms vary in complexity and that all individuals belonging to a species are created identical to one another. This very idea influenced scientific thinking for other scientists who succeeded him. In 1749, French naturalist Georges-Louis Blaclair, also known as Count Buffon, suggests that closely related species arose from a common ancestor and were actually changing. His idea was considered radical at the time. He made possible a new consideration of evolution and its causes from a scientific point of view, but still no one had proposed how species might change. The science of classifying organisms was an important endeavor during the mid-18th century. Carolus Linnaeus developed the binomial system of nomenclature, which is a two-part name for a species, and a system of classification for living organisms. Linnaeus, like other taxonomists of his time, believed in the fixity of species, that each species had an ideal form. He also believed in the scala naturae, a sequential ladder of life where the simplest beings occupy the lowest rungs and the most complex and spiritual beings, like the angels, humans, and then God, occupy the two highest rungs. Linnaeus changed the way scientists classify organisms. He divided plants and animals into broad kingdoms and subdivided them into phyla, classes, orders, families, genera, and species. For example, the coyote and the gray wolf share the same classification except for the level of species. Linnaeus also simplified naming of species using the binomial nomenclature. One name refers to the genus and the other one refers to the species. Genus name is written in capital letter and species name is written in small letter. In writing a scientific name, both the genus and species names should be underlined or written in italic form. The grandfather of Charles Darwin, Erasmus Darwin, was an 18th century physician and a naturalist. His writings suggest changes in animals during their development, animal breeding by humans, and the presence of vestigial structures. These vestigial structures are residual parts of an organism from a past ancestor that appears to have no function. Like Count Buffon, Erasmus Darwin thought that species might evolve. However, he offered no mechanism by which this change might occur. Baron Georges Cuvier is a distinguished zoologist who used his knowledge of anatomy to identify fossils and to describe the similarities among organisms. He was convinced of the idea of catastrophism. This is a theory that a series of brief local catastrophes such as enormous floods, volcanic eruptions, and earthquakes were responsible for most geological formations. He argued that catastrophes would destroy most of the organisms in an area, but then new life would arrive from surrounding areas. The idea of catastrophism was eventually challenged based on the observations and studies of two men, James Hutton and Charles Lyell. They explained that the Earth is subject to slow but continuous cycles of rock formation and erosion, not shaped by sudden catastrophes. Through the combined efforts of Lyell and Hutton, they went on to propose the theory of uniformitarianism, which states that the natural processes witnessed today are the same processes that occurred in the past. Therefore, gradual changes in some organisms could be represented in successive fossil layers preserved in sedimentary rocks. In the late 18th century, the French biologist Jean-Baptiste Lamarck became the first to offer a testable hypothesis explaining how evolution occurs via adaptation to the environment. In his law of use and disuse, he reasoned that organisms that used one part of their body repeatedly would increase their abilities, very much like weightlifters developing their strong arms. Conversely, disuse would weaken an organism until it disappeared. In his second law, Lamarck assumed that characteristics acquired through use and disuse could be passed on to future generations. To explain his ideas, he used giraffes as an example. He said that the long necks of giraffes developed over time because their necks grew longer as they stretched to reach food in tall trees. Now, this longer neck will then be passed on to their offspring. Lamarck's theory of evolution explains that the environment can produce physical changes in an organism during its lifetime, which can be inherited in the next generation. However, his idea was refuted later on by Charles Darwin. Before Charles Darwin ultimately solved the mechanism of evolution, he read the work of Thomas Malthus. In Malthus's essay on the principle of population, he stated that food availability, disease, and war limit the size of a human population. Charles Darwin applied similar principles to animal populations. The idea was that animals tend to produce more offspring than can survive, and that competition for limited resources in the environment is the element that determines survival. Through Malthus's principle, Charles Darwin was able to formulate his idea of natural selection. Charles Darwin developed his revolutionary proposal over time, influenced by the collective works of others and his travels. He was always interested in nature, but his father, who is a physician, saw no future for his son as a naturalist, so Charles was sent to medical school. Charles found medical school boring and quit eventually. He became the protege and friend of the botanist John Henslow, who recommended him to join the survey ship called HMS Beagle. This is a long voyage around the world. His recorded observations and fossil collections helped him write his book entitled On the Origin of Species. In this section, we will now study in further detail how Charles Darwin came up with the idea of natural selection. Darwin, who was only 22 at the time, joined a 5-year expedition on a ship called Beagle. The primary mission of the voyage was to chart poorly known stretches of the South American coastline. However, he ended up circumnavigating the world. Darwin spent most of his time on shore, observing and collecting thousands of plants and animals. Along the way, Darwin encountered species that were very different from those of his native England. He assumed that organisms are related through a common descent and that adaptation to various environments result in diversity. On his trip, Darwin observed massive geological changes firsthand. One example of which is when he observed marine shells high in the cliffs of Andes Mountains. Since weathering causes erosion, loose sediments from mountains are transported into the ocean, resulting to deposition of a strata. This strata contains fossils that are uplifted over long periods of time from below sea level to form land. From here, he became even more convinced that Earth is subject to slow geological changes. While Darwin was making geological observations, he also was collecting fossil specimens that differed somewhat from modern species. Among the thousands of specimens Darwin collected during this voyage were fossil glyptodonts. These armored mammals are extinct, but they have many unusual traits in common with modern armadillos. He also noted that armadillos live only in places where glyptodonts once lived. Since the Earth was indeed very old, he began to think that there should be enough time for descent with modification to occur, meaning species were not fixed and that they change over time. Darwin could not help but compare the animals of South America with those he observed in England. For example, instead of rabbits, he found Patagonian hares in the grasslands of South America. Both animals ate grass, hid in bushes, and moved rapidly using long hind legs. But while the Patagonian hare resembles a rabbit or even a small deer, it is actually more closely related to the rodents. Darwin wondered whether the similarities shared by these two animals arose due to their adaptation to the same type of environment. When he explored the Galapagos Islands, he found further evidence of this phenomenon. He noticed that each of the Galapagos Islands seemed to have its own type of tortoise, and Darwin began to wonder whether it has something to do with the type of vegetation available on each island. The tortoises with dome shells and short necks feed at ground level on islands with enough rainfall to support grasses, while those with shells that flare up in the front have long necks and live on arid islands where they feed on tall, tree like cacti. One of Darwin's most famous observations from the Galapagos Islands was his study of the finches. The finches' various beaks and behaviors are adapted to the specific foods available on their home islands. From here, Darwin realized that explaining such adaptations was essential to understanding evolution. Upon returning to England, Darwin began to reflect on the voyage and started collecting additional evidence in support of his ideas about how organisms adapt to the environment. In 1858, Alfred Russel Wallace sent an essay to Darwin in which he proposed a similar concept. Wallace identified thousands of species in his own exploration of the Malay archipelago for 8 years. Now, a joint paper outlining each of their theories was read out at the Linnean Society of London. Eventually, Charles Darwin proposed natural selection as the mechanism of evolutionary change. Let us now summarize Darwin's main arguments in support of natural selection. First, individuals in a species are different from one another, and at least some of this variation is heritable. For example, individuals in this population of Asian ladybird beetles vary in color and spot pattern. Natural selection may act on these variations only if they are heritable and that they affect the beetle's ability to survive and reproduce. Second, essential resources such as food and space are limited in every habitat. Darwin saw that the available resources are not sufficient to allow all members of a population to survive. Take, for instance, the elephants. If a pair of elephants underwent unrestricted reproduction, there would be 19 million elephants in 750 years. Obviously, no environment has the resources to support an elephant population of this magnitude. From here, there is a constant struggle for existence, and only certain members of a population can survive and reproduce each generation. And third, in every population, more offspring are born than can survive. For example, a single puffball fungus can produce billions of spores that give rise to offspring. However, not all of this will survive to maturity. Darwin realized that the capacity to overreproduce was characteristic of all species. Of the many eggs that are laid, only a tiny fraction complete their development and leave an offspring of their own. The rest are eaten, starved, deceased, unmated, or unable to tolerate physical conditions of the environment. To help visualize Darwin's inferences from his observations, let's consider giraffes as an example. From his observations, Darwin inferred that organisms engage in a struggle for existence. That is, they must compete for scarce resources. He also inferred that those individuals with the most adaptive traits would be most likely to win the competition, reproduce, and pass those favorable traits to the next generation. Lastly, Darwin's final inference was that over many generations, natural selection could change a population or even give rise to new species. Here is a summary of Darwin's notable observations. You may click pause to study them in detail. In the 1930s, scientists finally recognized the connection between natural selection and genetics. They unified these ideas into the modern evolutionary synthesis, which suggests that genetic mutation create heritable variation and that this variation is the raw material upon which natural selection acts. The modern synthesis combines the work of Darwin's natural selection and Mendel's experiments on inheritance. According to this theory, genes are responsible for the inheritance of characteristics. We now know that genes are segments of DNA that determines a trait. Mutations happen on these DNA sequences and they occur randomly in all organisms. Second, populations, not individuals, evolve due to natural selection and genetic drift. Although natural selection occurs through interactions between individual organisms and their environment, it is the population that evolves over time. Lastly, speciation is usually due to the gradual accumulation of small genetic changes. Sexual reproduction amplifies genetic variation. Along with this, if an environment changes or if individuals of a population move to a new environment, natural selection may result in adaptation to these new conditions, sometimes giving rise to new species. That would be all for today's lesson. Thank you for listening. If you have questions, please write them down on your exit ticket.